There's a stretch of road outside a small town, hidden away from the main highway, that has a reputation as the worst possible place to lose your way. The locals avoid it, dismissing it with muttered excuses and half-told warnings. But nobody ever shares the whole story, not until the kids from town started going missing again. It was only supposed to be a quick trip through the forest. 3 friends, Anna, Ben, and Clara, planned it as a weekend camping trip. They'd packed light, just the essentials, and left early enough to catch the sunrise. They'd grown up near these woods and knew them well, or at least they thought they did. The drive began with cheerful conversation and the usual nervous jokes about horror movies. Anna, driving, assured her friends that the shortcut through Harper's Trail would shave at least an hour off the trip. The others agreed. They'd all heard of the trail, but never actually used it. As they turned onto the road, the air grew dense, the trees leaning in like silent witnesses. 30 minutes passed before Clara noticed something strange. The road, which was supposed to be straightforward, had somehow twisted back on itself. The scenery grew repetitive, the same gnarled trees, the same moss-covered rocks. She felt a chill, but didn't say anything at first, not wanting to seem paranoid. But soon, Ben noticed it too. Anna laughed nervously, promising she'd find the way back. But her knuckles were white against the steering wheel, her eyes darting to the side mirror. They came upon a sign that read, "Welcome to Pine Hollow." None of them had ever heard of it. The name wasn't on any maps, and the phone signals had dropped minutes ago. Still, they convinced themselves they'd find a place to turn around. The town looked abandoned, as if frozen in time, with faded houses and rusting signs that squealed in the wind. As they passed the old general store, they saw a figure in the window, watching. Anna slowed down, and the figure's outline became clearer. A woman, thin and pale, standing perfectly still. She held something in her hand, but in the dim light, it was impossible to tell what. Ben rolled down his window and called out, "Hey, ma'am, do you know how to get back to the main road?" The woman's lips didn't move, but her eyes tracked them, unblinking. Clara urged Anna to keep driving, her voice laced with fear. Anna hesitated but finally agreed, speeding up as they left the silent figure behind. The road twisted through the woods, growing darker as though the trees themselves conspired to block out the sun. Shadows flickered just out of view, things that moved when they shouldn't. There was a stifling sense of being watched, of unseen eyes following their every move. A loud crack sounded from the back tire, and the car swerved violently. Anna fought for control as the vehicle lurched to a stop. They stumbled out only to find the tire shredded. Ben groaned, realizing they'd have to walk back to the town. With no other options, they gathered what they could carry and started down the road on foot, their nerves stretched thin. They reached the edge of Pine Hollow just as dusk began to settle. In the fading light, the town looked even worse, abandoned, decayed, and unsettlingly silent. They moved carefully past houses with broken windows and doors that creaked in the faint breeze. Anna noticed something peculiar. There were no cars, no bicycles, no signs of life. Yet, the houses seemed untouched by vandals, almost preserved. At the far end of the town square, they found the inn, its sign swaying with a creak. Hoping to find a phone or someone who could help, they hesitated at the entrance. The door was slightly ajar, and with a shared look, they pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and stale perfume. A light flickered from a chandelier, casting strange shadows that danced across the peeling wallpaper. Clara moved toward the counter, calling out. The silence was almost painful. Then slowly, the sounds began, a faint shuffling from upstairs, as if someone were moving across the floor with careful, measured steps. They glanced at each other, wondering if it was better to stay or run. Before they could decide, footsteps echoed down the staircase. A man in a gray suit appeared, his face expressionless, his eyes cold and hollow. "Need a room?" he asked, his voice devoid of emotion. Ben stammered, explaining that they'd only come to use the phone, but the man shook his head slowly. "Phone's been out for years. Best stay the night. Roads aren't safe after dark." His eyes flicked toward the window, where the trees seemed to press against the glass. With no other options, they agreed. The man handed them a single key and gestured toward the stairs. They climbed to the second floor, each step creaking underfoot, the walls lined with faded portraits of people who seemed to watch them. In their room, the bed was ancient, the sheets yellowed and brittle. They took turns sitting by the window, unable to sleep, their nerves on edge. Around midnight, they heard a faint scratching at the door. Clara held her breath, staring as the handle turned slowly, creaking as though someone on the other side was testing it. Anna whispered for them to stay quiet, clutching her phone as though it might suddenly work. The scratching continued, relentless, but the door didn't open. Finally, the noises stopped. They waited in silence until the first hint of dawn broke, then gathered their things and left the room. The hallway was empty, but something was different. The pictures on the wall, the faces had changed. Each one now bore a look of horror, eyes wide, mouths open as if in a scream. Ben pointed it out, his face pale, and they hurried down the stairs. The man in the gray suit was gone, but as they passed the counter, they noticed something that hadn't been there before. A guest book, open and blank except for a single entry from the night before, written in familiar handwriting. Their names. Panicking, they bolted out of the inn, only to find the town shrouded in mist. The road was nowhere to be seen, swallowed up by the dense fog. They ran in the direction they thought would lead them back, but no matter how far they went, the same buildings appeared over and over, shifting as though the town were alive, trapping them in its web. Hours passed, maybe days. They lost track of time as exhaustion wore them down. In desperation, they split up, each hoping to find an exit, but every path led them back to the center of Pine Hollow. On the fifth night, or maybe it was the sixth, Clara heard faint voices calling her name. She followed, stumbling into a clearing just outside the town square. Anna and Ben stood there, their eyes vacant, their skin pale and lifeless. They whispered her name in unison, their voices hollow echoes of what they once were. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. In the end, the town swallowed them whole, just as it had with countless others before. The road remained, luring new travelers to take the wrong turn, to wander unknowingly into Pine Hollow where no one ever truly leaves. They called it Devil's Pass, a twisting, narrow road deep in the Appalachian Mountains. It was known to be haunted, cursed. Stories said those who ventured too far often didn't return. Most locals avoided it, but there was no warning sign to tell strangers to stay away. When Liz and her boyfriend Tom took a wrong turn onto Devil's Pass, one late stormy night, they had no idea what was in store. They'd been on a long road trip, hoping to reach a cozy cabin rental on the other side of the mountain before the storm hit. Tom had shrugged off the last turn, saying the GPS probably just hadn't updated. They'd been winding along narrow roads for an hour, the rain pounding harder, and Liz was getting anxious. The trees pressed in close, almost claustrophobic in the headlights, and there were no other cars in sight, just miles of dense, dark forest. After a few more bends, they came upon something bizarre. A car, seemingly abandoned in the middle of the road. Tom pulled up behind it, squinting to see through the rain-streaked windshield. The car's windows were fogged over as though it had been sitting there for hours. Liz shivered. The road was deserted, and there was no sign of the driver. Reluctantly, Tom got out to investigate, leaving Liz alone in the car with only the sound of her own breathing. He returned a few moments later, pale and tight-lipped. "It's weird," he said, shaking his head. "The car looks like it's been here a while, but it's unlocked and the keys are still in the ignition." He hesitated. "There's also something odd about the seats. It's like..." He trailed off, unwilling to say more, and Liz didn't press. They had the same instinct, to leave, fast. But as they pulled away, a scraping sound echoed behind them, like someone dragging metal against the road. Liz turned around, squinting out the back window. She gasped. The abandoned car had turned its headlights back on and was creeping forward, following them at a slow, menacing pace. Tom pressed on the gas, the engine whining as he sped around the next corner. But as soon as they rounded the bend, the headlights reappeared, following them closer, faster. Liz's heart pounded. No matter how fast they drove, the car stayed on their tail, the engine roaring louder as if trying to push them off the road. Just then, Tom slammed on the brakes. He hadn't hit anything, but the car had come to an abrupt halt, jolting them both forward. Liz looked up to see a figure standing directly in front of their car, drenched in the rain. Head down, hands hanging at strange angles. It was a woman, her hair soaked and clinging to her face, her body limp and unnatural. She didn't move, even as their headlights blazed on her. "Tom, don't," Liz whispered as he began to lower the window, calling out, asking if she was okay. The woman didn't answer. She didn't so much as twitch. But Liz noticed something horrifying. Her arms, bent at odd angles, looked like they'd been broken, like something had twisted them in ways they weren't meant to go. "Let's just go," she urged, a tremor in her voice. But Tom seemed transfixed, staring at the woman, almost hypnotized. The figure took a step forward, her head tilting slowly, an unnatural crack echoing as she finally looked up. Her eyes were pitch black, empty voids staring directly at him. A thin, cracked smile spread across her face, stretching far too wide. Finally, snapping out of his trance, Tom slammed on the gas, swerving around the woman, but her face stayed fixed in his mind. They sped down the road, each bend in the dark, winding trail more disorienting than the last. The road seemed to twist and narrow, the forest pressing in around them, darker and more oppressive. Liz clung to her seat, praying they would find their way back to the highway. But the nightmare wasn't over. Soon they came upon the woman again, standing in the middle of the road. Tom cursed, his grip tight on the wheel, but they couldn't turn back now. He swerved to the side, speeding past her, but just as they passed, Liz saw her face through the window. Smiling, her mouth forming silent words, her empty eyes wide and unblinking. They drove on, pushing the car faster, skidding around hairpin turns as the rain poured harder. Finally, they spotted something in the distance. An old gas station, dimly lit, its neon sign barely glowing in the storm. Relieved, they pulled in, hoping to find shelter and a working phone. The place was run down, clearly abandoned for years, but they saw a faint glow coming from inside. They climbed out, drenched and terrified, and pushed open the gas station door. Inside, the walls were lined with faded posters, the shelves covered in dust, and the floor littered with debris. There was no sign of a phone, but in the dim light, Liz noticed something that froze her in place. Tacked up on a wall near the counter was a missing persons poster from nearly 10 years ago, a woman with hauntingly familiar features. Her eyes stared out from the poster, empty and black. The caption read, "Missing since 2008, last seen on Devil's Pass Road." Tom and Liz exchanged horrified glances. They turned to leave, but the door was blocked. The woman stood there, her head tilted, that same grotesque smile stretched across her face. She held out her hand, her fingers bent and broken, reaching out for them. The last thing Liz heard before everything went dark was the low, echoing sound of the woman's voice as she whispered, "Come with me. I'll show you the way." Days later, the authorities found Tom's car abandoned on the side of Devil's Pass. The vehicle was empty, the interior soaked, though the rain had stopped long before they arrived. The back seat bore 2 deep scratches, the only sign left behind by Liz and Tom, and 2 broken fingerprints smudged on the window. To this day, travelers swear they see the outline of a woman, pale and twisted, wandering the road on dark, rainy nights, her empty eyes still searching for someone to take her place. There's a long, winding road up in the northern woods that doesn't appear on any maps. It's an unmarked detour that people stumble upon by accident, especially at night. They say that road has an appetite, that it waits for travelers who've lost their way. Caleb and Sarah found that out the hard way on a cold, foggy night, miles from anywhere, when they took a wrong turn and ended up on what locals called Cinder Hollow Road. They'd been on their way to a friend's cabin for a weekend escape. The fog had rolled in fast, covering everything in thick white haze, and the GPS kept glitching. As Caleb tried to get his bearings, they ended up on a road they didn't recognize, narrow and dark, with trees leaning over like the gnarled arms of giants. Sarah had a bad feeling, but said nothing, her eyes glued to the rearview mirror. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was following them, though she saw nothing but dense mist trailing behind the car. The road twisted deeper into the forest, and soon all signs of civilization disappeared. No lights, no houses, only trees and shadows. Caleb muttered under his breath, trying to joke it off, but he was just as uneasy. The silence was thick, pressing in on them, until they saw something bizarre up ahead. An old wooden sign, barely legible, that read, "Welcome to Harlan's Rest." Neither of them had ever heard of a town by that name. But up ahead, faintly illuminated in the headlights, they could just make out the outlines of buildings hidden in the fog. As they drove closer, the shapes took form. Abandoned houses, crumbling storefronts, and a gas station with shattered windows. It looked like the town had been left to rot, forgotten by everyone but the forest. They pulled up to the gas station, hoping they'd find someone to ask for directions. But as they climbed out, they were struck by the stillness. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and decay. Sarah tried to shake off the chill running up her spine as she peeked through the cracked glass of the gas station window. Inside, the shelves were still stocked, dust-covered but otherwise untouched. Magazines from decades ago sat in neat stacks, as though the place had been abandoned overnight. They'd just turned to leave when Caleb spotted movement at the edge of the forest, a dark figure standing just inside the tree line, half hidden by fog. It was a man dressed in old-fashioned clothes watching them. Caleb called out, but the figure didn't respond, just tilted its head slowly as though observing them with a strange, quiet interest. Sarah grabbed Caleb's arm, urging him back into the car. But as they got in, the fog thickened, swallowing the road they'd come from. The only way forward now led deeper into the town, and they had no choice but to follow it, hoping they'd find an exit on the other side. The road led them into the heart of Harlan's Rest, past more decaying buildings. They passed what looked like an old movie theater, its sign still advertising a horror film that had come out decades ago. The fog seemed to thicken with every block, muffling all sounds. Sarah rolled down her window to call out, hoping someone would answer. But there was no sound, no birds, no wind, just an empty silence. Then they heard it. A faint humming, a low, guttural tune coming from somewhere nearby. Caleb stopped the car, and they listened, hearts pounding as the tune grew louder. Slowly, the fog parted to reveal a figure standing in the middle of the road, dressed in ragged clothing, its face pale and expressionless. The humming grew louder as it stepped closer, and Sarah realized with a chill that its mouth wasn't moving. Caleb hit the gas, swerving to avoid the figure, but as they passed, they saw its eyes, pitch black, fixed on them, following them as they sped by. Sarah glanced out the back window, her heart hammering. The figure had turned to watch them, its head tilting at an unnatural angle, still humming that awful, tuneless melody. They drove faster, desperate to find their way out, but every turn seemed to lead them deeper into the town. The buildings became more warped and twisted, as though something had tried to mold them into strange, unsettling shapes. Some of the houses had doors that opened too wide or windows that seemed to blink like eyes, watching as they passed. Shadows darted between the buildings, figures moving just at the edge of the fog, watching, waiting. Finally, they saw a break in the fog up ahead, a way out. Caleb accelerated, relief washing over him. But as they reached the edge of town, the road suddenly curved back, leading them right back to the gas station. In the rearview mirror, they saw the figures gathering behind them, a line of pale, blank faces, all watching in eerie silence. Caleb floored the gas, desperate to escape, but the road twisted and turned, leading them back into the same loop. Panic set in. Sarah's voice was hoarse from screaming, pleading with Caleb to find a way out, but it was no use. The town was holding them, twisting the road to keep them from leaving. They were trapped, just like everyone else who had wandered into Harlan's Rest. In a last, desperate attempt, Caleb slammed on the brakes, bringing the car to a screeching halt. They stumbled out, prepared to run through the trees if they had to, but the fog was thick now they could barely see a foot ahead. And then they heard it again. That low, eerie humming, coming from all directions, growing louder as the figures emerged from the mist, closing in around them. The last thing Caleb and Sarah saw was a face, inches from theirs, pale and empty, its black eyes staring into theirs. And then there was only darkness. The next morning, a local park ranger found Caleb's car parked on the side of a different road miles away, the doors wide open, keys still in the ignition. There was no sign of Caleb or Sarah, no tracks, no footprints, just fog, thick and impenetrable, covering the road. And to this day, the townspeople say that if you drive too far down Cinder Hollow Road, especially on foggy nights, you might find yourself in Harlan's Rest, a place that welcomes you in and never lets you leave. It was late October, and the leaves were at their brightest reds and oranges, glowing against the dying sunlight. Aaron had been driving for hours, heading home from a business trip that had taken him deeper into the countryside than he'd ever been. He was growing tired, his eyes burning from staring at the road for so long. That's when he saw a sign for Ravens Cross Road. He didn't remember it being on the map, but he assumed it would cut a few hours off his trip. Besides, the main highway was empty, dark, and dull. A quiet road might help him relax a little before he got home. As soon as he turned onto Ravens Cross, he knew something felt off. The road was narrow, the trees thick and almost leaning inward as though they were watching him pass. Twilight settled in and the fog started to rise off the ground, curling around his car like misty fingers. The road twisted and turned in ways that didn't seem natural, and Aaron couldn't shake the feeling that the trees were growing closer, closing him in. An hour passed, and he realized he hadn't seen another car or even a single house. The fog grew thicker, and Aaron's headlights seemed to barely cut through it. He was just about to pull over to check his map when he saw something strange. A figure standing just at the edge of the road. A man dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned coat, a dark-brimmed hat hiding his face. Aaron slowed down, squinting through the fog to get a better look, but as he passed, the man didn't move, didn't even glance up. Aaron drove a little faster, feeling a chill spread through him. The figure was gone, but he had this awful feeling that he hadn't seen the last of him. After another half hour, he noticed his gas gauge was dipping dangerously low. Panicking, he decided he'd stop at the next town he came across, fill up, and get his bearings. But mile after mile passed, and there was no town, no lights, only more dense forest and that clinging, thick fog. Just when he was about to give up hope, he spotted lights in the distance. A gas station, the faint neon sign glowing through the mist. Relieved, Aaron pulled in, but as he parked, a wave of dread washed over him. The gas station was old and run down, its windows broken and boarded up. The pumps were rusty, and there was no sign of anyone around. Still, he couldn't risk running out of gas in the middle of nowhere, so he got out, hoping the pump would still work. As he stepped toward it, he felt eyes on him, like someone was watching from the shadows. He looked around, his heart pounding, but saw no one. He lifted the nozzle, but just as he did, the neon sign began to flicker, casting strange shadows across the ground. Then he saw it. The figure from the road, standing under the neon glow, staring at him. Only now he could see the man's face, pale and hollow, his eyes too dark, like empty pits. Aaron dropped the nozzle and jumped back, his voice catching in his throat as he stumbled into his car. He fumbled with the keys, stealing a glance in the rearview mirror. But there was no one there. The figure had vanished, and the gas station was empty again. Heart pounding, he started the car and sped off, hoping to leave the nightmare behind him. Minutes later, Aaron began to calm down, convincing himself that the stress and the fog were playing tricks on him. But as he rounded the next curve, his stomach dropped. In the headlights, there was another gas station, an exact copy of the one he'd just left. Same broken windows, same flickering sign. And there, standing under the neon glow, was the same man, staring at him with those hollow eyes. Aaron's hands shook as he drove past, not daring to look at the man as he passed. His mind raced, wondering if he was driving in circles, if somehow he was lost on a road that didn't obey the usual laws of reality. He tried to drive faster, but the road only twisted more, narrowing and winding deeper into the foggy forest. After another few minutes, he saw another sign, and his heart sank. Ravens Cross Gas Station. The letters painted in faded red. It was the same gas station. This time, the figure was standing in the middle of the road, waiting for him, his eyes locked onto Aaron's. Aaron slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop. He couldn't take his eyes off the figure, who seemed to float toward him, his steps slow and deliberate, until he was standing right outside Aaron's window. The man's face was inches from his dark, hollow eyes staring, unblinking, through the glass. Aaron wanted to scream, wanted to drive, but he was paralyzed with fear, his fingers gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles went white. Then, slowly, the man lifted one finger, pointing down the road, his expression never changing. Aaron's hands were shaking so hard he could barely hold the wheel, but he forced himself to start the car, his heart pounding in his throat. He didn't know why, but he felt compelled to follow the figure's silent command. He turned the car in the direction the man had pointed and began to drive, the fog thickening around him until he could barely see the road. He drove for what felt like hours, the fog wrapping around him like a shroud, the road narrowing with every mile. Finally, he spotted something in the distance, a single, faded sign that read, "Exit to Ravens Cross Cemetery." He had no idea where he was or how he'd gotten there, but he felt an overwhelming sense that he had to keep going. He was trapped, his fate somehow entwined with this cursed road. Then he saw them, dozens of figures, standing along the side of the road, their faces pale and empty, their hollow eyes watching him as he drove past. They were dressed in clothes from all different eras, some modern, some impossibly old. They stood in silence, lining the road, each one staring at him as though they'd been waiting for him for a long, long time. With his heart pounding and his mind screaming at him to stop, Aaron finally broke free of the forest, the figures fading into the mist behind him. The road opened up, leading him back onto a highway, a familiar sign up ahead. He didn't look back, didn't dare. But even as he sped down the highway, desperate to leave Ravenscross behind, he felt it. The weight of all those eyes still watching him. When Aaron finally made it home, he was shaken and exhausted, but safe, or so he thought. That night, as he drifted to sleep, he heard it. The faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, outside his bedroom window. And just before dawn, when he finally fell into a fitful sleep, he dreamed of a road, winding through the fog, lined with faces all waiting, their hollow eyes fixed on him. When he woke, his car keys were missing. And outside, in the damp earth just beyond his front door, were a single set of footprints. Sasha and her friends were road tripping across the Midwest, driving through miles of flat, endless fields as they made their way to a music festival. Late one night, after hours of driving, they took a wrong turn that led them down an empty, narrow road, deeper into unknown territory. At first, they laughed it off, cracking jokes and enjoying the break from the monotony. But soon the laughter faded as they realized the road was getting narrower, the fields closing in, their headlights barely piercing the inky darkness. They hadn't passed a single car or house in over an hour, and the GPS had gone silent, showing nothing but a blank screen with an error message that read, "No connection." Sasha tried to stay calm, assuring everyone that they'd find their way back. But just as she said it, they noticed something strange up ahead. Two large, rusted gates, wide open, inviting them onto an unmarked dirt road. The gates seemed old, wrought iron twisted into strange shapes, almost like faces frozen in silent screams. Sasha hesitated, but her friend Maddie, exhausted and eager to get back on track, urged her to keep going. "It's probably just an old farm entrance," Maddie said. "Maybe there's a town up ahead." The road was rough, bumping their car with every few feet. Soon, the fields around them turned into thick woods, the trees clawing toward the sky. There was no sign of any town or farm. But then, just as they were considering turning around, they saw lights flickering through the trees just up ahead. The road opened up into a large, eerie clearing, surrounded by towering pines. In the middle of the clearing was a small, old-fashioned town square, like something out of the early 1900s. The buildings were dimly lit, casting a faint golden glow, and there were people milling about, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, their faces blank and expressionless. The square was silent, despite the small crowd, and Sasha felt an uncomfortable prickle at the back of her neck. "Weird tourist spot?" Maddie whispered, though she sounded unconvinced. They parked and got out, hesitant but curious. The air felt thick, almost heavy, and they could hear a faint, slow melody playing somewhere in the distance, like an old record spinning just slightly off beat. As they wandered toward the square, Sasha noticed something odd. No one was talking, laughing, or even acknowledging each other. The townspeople, if that's what they were, just drifted along, their eyes glassy and unfocused, as if they were sleepwalking. One of the men turned and looked directly at her, his gaze piercing, and Sasha felt a chill run down her spine. His face was pale, and he wore a worn suit that looked like it hadn't been changed in years. His eyes were vacant, yet locked on her in a way that felt wrong, like he was seeing something beyond her. Then he looked away, almost mechanically, resuming his slow, shuffling pace. Sasha's friends were equally unsettled, and they quickly decided to head back to the car. But when they turned to leave, they found themselves face to face with a young woman in a faded blue dress. She looked normal at first, with dark curls and a soft smile, but as she drew closer, they realized her eyes were strange. Dark, hollow, almost too wide for her face. "Are you here for the festival?" she asked, her voice sweet and unnatural, like she was reading from a script. "Festival?" Sasha replied, her voice cracking. The woman nodded slowly, her face stretching into a smile that seemed far too large, too eager. "You're just in time. It's a very special night." Sasha's instincts screamed at her to leave, but her curiosity got the best of her. "What festival?" The woman tilted her head, her eyes never leaving Sasha's. "It's the Festival of Returning. All who arrive must join." She gestured toward a large, weathered poster nailed to a tree nearby. The edges were torn and faded, but Sasha could still make out the words, "Join us for the Festival of Returning, every autumn." There was no year, no location, just the words, like an old invitation that had been waiting for her. Sasha pulled Maddie back, muttering that they should go. But as they turned, the lights in the square dimmed, and the townsfolk began gathering, moving toward the center of the clearing, their faces still blank, lifeless. A hush fell over the crowd and a low chant began, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the ground, up into Sasha's bones. "We have to go now," Sasha said, pulling Maddie and their friend Logan toward the car. But when they reached it, they saw something that made their hearts stop. The car was surrounded by figures, townsfolk who had appeared out of nowhere, blocking their way back to the road. Their faces were all the same, pale, empty-eyed, and stretched into unsettling, crooked smiles. Desperate, Logan tried to push through, but one of the men grabbed him, his grip cold and unyielding. "Stay," he whispered, his voice low and hollow. "It's time." The music grew louder, discordant and eerie as the chanting filled the air. The townsfolk began moving in unison, swaying to the beat, their faces still blank but their movements disturbingly coordinated, like puppets controlled by invisible strings. Then, the woman in the blue dress appeared again, standing in the center of the square, her smile wider than before. She raised her arms and the crowd fell silent. "Welcome," she called, her voice echoing. "Tonight, we honor those who have returned, and tonight, you join us." Before they could react, the lights in the square flared, blinding them. When the light faded, they found themselves standing in the middle of the crowd, surrounded by the townsfolk, their faces all fixed on them, smiling, waiting. Panicked, Sasha screamed, trying to push through the crowd, but they closed in around her, cold hands grasping her arms, her shoulders, her face. She looked over at Maddie, whose eyes were wide with terror, her mouth moving in a silent scream, but the chanting drowned her out. Logan was nowhere to be seen. The last thing Sasha remembered was the face of the woman in the blue dress, staring down at her, her eyes dark and empty. "Now you'll never leave," she whispered, and everything went black. The next morning, locals found their car parked at the edge of the woods, doors open, keys still in the ignition, as if they'd just walked off and never come back. But no one saw any sign of Sasha, Maddie, or Logan. A few weeks later, travelers passing through the area started talking about a strange, eerie town hidden in the woods. They mentioned old-fashioned buildings and townsfolk dressed in clothes from a different era. They talked about how the people in the town didn't speak, just drifted, their faces blank and their eyes hollow, as though they were waiting for something or someone. And sometimes they said, if you looked close enough, you might see a few new faces among the crowd, faces that looked confused, lost, as though they'd just arrived. Alec had been driving for hours, long past sunset, and the twisting mountain roads were starting to blur. It was supposed to be a short trip to his cousin's place, but construction and detours had stretched the drive longer and longer. Just when he thought he'd missed his turn, a new road sign popped up, the faded letters reading, "Welcome to Red Pines." Relieved, he took the exit, hoping to find somewhere to rest. He soon realized the road led him deeper into the dense forest, the trees thicker and closer than they had been along the highway. Finally, he saw the lights of a small town glowing dimly through the pines. Pulling into what seemed like the main street, he noticed something odd. The buildings were all old, the paint peeling, the wood rotting. The streets were deserted, the only sound the faint hum of his own engine. Up ahead, a sign read, "The Red Pines Inn." Alec decided he'd stop for the night, then head out first thing in the morning. The inn was small and charming in a forgotten way, the kind of place that had probably been built decades ago and never updated. The front door creaked as he pushed it open, and a small bell tinkled from somewhere above. The front desk was empty, and there was no sign of anyone else around. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing. After a moment, an older woman appeared, her face lined and expressionless. "Room for the night?" she asked, her voice flat, devoid of warmth. Alec nodded, trying to shake off the feeling that something was off. "Just for tonight." The woman slid a dusty brass key across the counter without saying another word, her eyes never quite meeting his. Alec thanked her and headed up the creaky stairs to his room. The hallway was dimly lit, the walls lined with old portraits in dark, heavy frames. And as he passed, he had the oddest feeling that the eyes in the portraits were following him. He shook it off as tiredness, found his room, and locked the door behind him. The room was small, with worn furniture and a dusty old carpet, but he didn't care. He just needed to sleep. As he was unpacking, Alec noticed something odd. There was no mirror. He walked over to where one should have been above the dresser, but all that remained were 4 nail marks in the wall, like the mirror had been pulled down or taken away. When he lay down, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He stared up at the ceiling, listening to the ticking of a clock somewhere outside his door. Just as he was drifting off, he heard a soft, shuffling sound coming from the hallway, followed by a faint knock on his door. "Hello?" he called, his voice barely above a whisper. Silence. He waited, his heart pounding, but no one responded. He got out of bed and opened the door to find the hallway empty, the portraits staring back at him with their dark, unreadable eyes. One of the paintings, a young woman with long, dark hair, seemed to be staring directly at him, her expression almost pleading. Shaken, Alec closed the door and lay back down, trying to calm himself. But no sooner had he closed his eyes than the knocking started again, louder this time, almost insistent. Fed up, Alec yanked open the door, ready to confront whoever was behind this, but again, nothing. Just the empty hallway and the silent portraits staring at him. The air felt thick, almost heavy, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was intruding on something he wasn't meant to see. He was about to close the door when he noticed something strange. A faint trail of muddy footprints leading down the hall. He hadn't seen them earlier, and they seemed to lead from room to room, as though someone had been going door to door. Against his better judgment, Alec followed the trail down the hall, stopping at each door and listening. All he heard was silence, until he reached the end of the hall, where the footprints stopped in front of the last room. The door was slightly ajar, the light inside flickering, casting strange shadows across the floor. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, only to freeze in horror. The room was empty, except for a large, broken mirror leaning against the far wall. The glass was cracked, distorting the reflections, but as he got closer, Alec noticed something horrifying. In the reflection, he could see the entire hallway, but something was wrong. Shadows moved in the mirror, dark figures with hollow eyes drifting up and down the hall, peering into each room. They had no faces, only empty voids where their eyes and mouths should have been. And then he saw himself in the mirror. But his reflection wasn't standing still. It was watching him, staring back with an expression of terror. Suddenly, one of the shadowy figures turned toward him, its hollow eyes locking onto his reflection. Alex stumbled backward, his heart racing, but his reflection stayed frozen in place, the expression of horror etched onto its face. He bolted out of the room, racing back down the hall to his own door, slamming it behind him. He pressed his back against the door, breathing heavily, trying to calm himself. But when he turned to look, he saw that his room was different. The bed was old, moth-eaten, the walls bare, stripped of any furniture or decorations. It was as though the room hadn't been used in decades. The realization hit him hard. The Red Pines Inn wasn't just a place for travelers. It was a trap, a place that collected people, keeping them locked in its shadowy halls. The portraits in the hallway, the eyes that followed him, they weren't just paintings. They were real people, people who had stayed here and never left. He had to get out. Alec threw his bag over his shoulder and ran down the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the empty lobby. But when he reached the front door, he found it locked, the old iron bolt jammed tight. Desperate, he pounded on the door, shouting for help, but no one came. Then he heard it, a voice, faint and distant, whispering his name. He turned, and there, standing in the middle of the lobby, was the woman from the portrait. She was real, her skin pale and her eyes hollow, staring at him with that same pleading expression. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "No one leaves." Alec backed away, his heart racing. But he felt something cold, something invisible, wrapping around his arms, pulling him back toward the hallway. The shadows were closing in, drifting toward him from every corner of the inn, their empty eyes fixed on him, their whispers filling his ears. With one final, desperate scream, Alec tried to break free, but the darkness swallowed him, pulling him into the shadows. The last thing he saw was his own terrified reflection staring back at him from the broken mirror, his eyes wide with horror. The next morning, a young couple driving through the mountains saw an old sign on the side of the road that read, "Red Pines Inn." Curious, they pulled over, thinking they might stay the night. They didn't notice the cracked mirror in the lobby or the newest portrait hanging in the hallway. A young man with dark hair, his eyes wide and filled with terror, forever staring back, at anyone who dared to look. Liz was driving through the back roads of northern Maine, where the trees stretched tall and close, casting long shadows over the narrow road. She'd set out early that morning, aiming to make it to her friend's cabin by dusk, but she'd underestimated just how remote and winding the roads were. As the sun sank lower, she realized she'd missed her turn miles back. Her GPS had lost signal, and the winding road was starting to feel endless. It was getting dark quickly, and there was no cell service. She was tired, disoriented, and beginning to worry, so she felt a surge of relief when she saw a dim glow ahead in the trees. As she got closer, she saw it was a small, rundown gas station, the neon sign flickering weakly. The place looked like it hadn't been in business for years, but she figured maybe she could at least ask for directions. She pulled in, her tires crunching over loose gravel, and climbed out, feeling a chill in the air. The station was dark inside, except for a faint yellow light hanging over the counter. Liz knocked on the door, but no one came. She was just about to head back to her car when an old man appeared, stepping out from the shadows behind the counter. He was thin and hunched, with sunken eyes that glinted in the dim light. "You lost?" he asked in a gravelly voice, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her uneasy. "Yeah," Liz replied, forcing a smile. "I'm trying to find a road that'll lead me to Larkspur Lake. Do you know the way?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he just stared at her, his face expressionless. Then, after a long pause, he nodded slowly. "I can show you a shortcut," he said, his voice low and flat. "Take the path behind the station. It'll get you there faster than the main road." Liz hesitated. Something about the man felt off, but she didn't have many options. "Are you sure?" she asked, glancing back at her car. The main road had led her in circles. Maybe this shortcut was the quickest way. He nodded again, his eyes never leaving hers. "It's a backwoods road, not on any map, but it'll get you there faster." Thanking him, Liz got back into her car, reversing out and pulling around the side of the gas station where a dirt path led into the thick woods. She took a deep breath and started down the narrow, bumpy trail, the dark trees pressing close on either side. The road was rough, winding sharply, and she had to slow down to navigate around fallen branches and ruts in the path. After about 20 minutes, she realized she hadn't seen any sign of a lake or any other road. She was beginning to feel uneasy, the hairs on her neck standing up as the woods grew darker, the silence oppressive. She checked her phone again, but there was still no service. Then, up ahead, she spotted a strange shape in the middle of the path. She squinted, slowing her car to a crawl as she approached. It looked like an animal lying still in the dirt. As she got closer, she could see it was a deer, but something was wrong. Its body was stretched and twisted in an unnatural way, the legs sticking out at odd angles. Horrified, she swerved around it, her heart pounding. But as she passed, she thought she saw something. No, someone, standing among the trees, just beyond the edge of her headlights. It was a figure, tall and thin, watching her from the shadows. She could only make out the outline, but it didn't move, just stood there, staring. Liz pressed down on the gas pedal, her heart racing as she sped along the rough road. The trees seemed to close in around her, the shadows growing darker and thicker, almost swallowing the path. She glanced in her rearview mirror and her blood ran cold. There was a figure standing in the road behind her, exactly where the deer had been, watching her car as it sped away. She forced herself to focus on the road, trying to calm her breathing. Just keep going, she thought. The lake has to be close. But as she rounded another curve, she saw it, another deer, lying in the road, its body twisted in the exact same way as the one before. And beside it, barely visible in the darkness, was the same figure, staring at her from the trees, its eyes catching the light and glinting in the shadows. Panic surged through her. She didn't know how it was possible, but she was certain it was the same deer, the same figure. She had somehow circled back, even though the road had been going straight for miles. She tried to turn the car around, but the path was too narrow, so she kept driving, her hands gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. After another mile, the headlights picked up a clearing up ahead, and Liz felt a momentary surge of relief. But when she reached it, her stomach dropped. She was back at the gas station, the same broken-down pumps, the same dim neon sign flickering weakly. And there, standing in the middle of the road, was the old man, his face twisted into a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Liz slammed on the brakes, her heart hammering. She watched as the man slowly raised one bony hand, pointing back down the path she had just come from, his expression empty, almost mechanical. She rolled down her window, her voice trembling. "I don't understand. I took the shortcut, but I'm right back where I started." The old man's grin widened, and he stepped closer, his eyes dark and hollow. "The path always leads back here. Everyone who takes it comes back. You'll find the way out if you're meant to." Without another word, he turned and shuffled back toward the gas station, disappearing into the shadows. Liz sat there, shaken, feeling trapped. Her hands trembled as she pulled her phone out, desperate for a signal. She held it up, trying to catch even a faint bar of service, when something strange happened. A faint static crackled through her speakers, and a voice, low and distorted, whispered her name. She stared at her phone, but it was still dead, the screen blank. The voice whispered again, louder this time, filling the car. "Liz, the road is waiting." Panicking, she threw the car into reverse, intending to get as far away from this place as possible. But just as she did, the figure from the woods stepped out from the shadows, standing right behind her car. She slammed on the brakes, her heart pounding as the figure stepped closer, until she could see its face in the dim light. It was her own face, staring back at her, eyes hollow and mouth twisted into the same eerie smile as the old man's. Her own reflection looked at her with an expression of calm acceptance, like it had been waiting there for her all along. The next morning, a traveler passing through found her car abandoned at the side of the road near the gas station, the doors open and the keys still in the ignition. Liz was never seen again, though locals often say they see a figure in the woods along that same narrow road, watching them from the trees with hollow eyes and a twisted, haunting smile. Marcus had taken this drive dozens of times before, but tonight it felt different. The fog was thick, pressing in on all sides, swallowing the road. He'd been driving up to his family's cabin every autumn since he was a kid, but something about tonight's drive felt wrong. It was like the forest was shifting around him, bending the roads and hills into new shapes. His GPS had lost signal hours ago, but he trusted he could get there by memory. However, as he continued down the road, he realized he didn't recognize a single landmark. He was beginning to worry when he saw a sign he didn't remember ever seeing before. Crow Creek Village, next left. Thinking he could stop for directions, he took the turn and drove down a narrow dirt road that wound deeper into the forest. Eventually, he reached a clearing where a small village lay beneath a canopy of dense trees. It looked like something frozen in time, the buildings old and weathered but well kept, as if from a forgotten century. There were no cars, just horse-drawn carts parked along the muddy street. The only source of light came from lanterns hanging on poles and the faint glow in the windows of the houses. There was something deeply quiet about the place. Marcus stepped out of his car, feeling uneasy as he walked toward what looked like an inn, the only building with an open door. As he stepped inside, a faint bell above the door tinkled, and a group of people turned to look at him. Their faces were pale and drawn, their eyes wide as though they hadn't seen a stranger in years. They wore old-fashioned clothes, long skirts and high collars, leather boots and suspenders. An older man, his face lined and serious, approached Marcus. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his voice carrying an odd accent Marcus couldn't place. "Yes, actually," Marcus replied, feeling the weight of everyone's stares. "I'm trying to get to Ashland, but I must have taken a wrong turn. Could you point me in the right direction?" The man's expression didn't change. "Ashland? That's far from here. You're better off resting for the night and trying again in the morning." Marcus hesitated, glancing around at the others, all watching him with expressions of quiet intensity. Something told him not to stay, that he should get back in his car and leave. But the fog was so thick outside he could barely see his own car from the door. Reluctantly, he nodded. "All right, do you have a room?" The man gestured to a staircase. "Upstairs. First door on the left." Marcus climbed the narrow stairs, his footsteps creaking. The room was simple, with a narrow bed and a small window that looked out onto the empty village below. He set down his bag, feeling uneasy, and noticed there was no lock on the door. The bed felt hard and cold, but he was too tired to care. He lay down and tried to sleep, but his mind wouldn't let him rest. Every time he closed his eyes, he could feel that same strange quietness pressing in, as if something were watching him from just outside the door. Around midnight, he heard footsteps in the hall. They were soft and careful, moving up and down, stopping in front of each door. Marcus lay still, listening. After a moment, he heard a faint whisper just outside his door. "Is he one of us?" Another voice, lower, raspier, replied, "Not yet." Marcus's heart pounded in his chest as he sat up slowly, straining to hear more. But the voices fell silent, replaced by the sound of footsteps fading down the hall. He crept to the door, pressing his ear against it, but heard nothing else. Cautiously, he opened the door a crack and peered into the hallway. It was empty, dimly lit by a single candle flickering at the far end. He closed the door and went to the window, looking out onto the village below. He felt his stomach twist as he saw the people from earlier, all standing perfectly still, facing the inn, their pale faces staring up at his window. They didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there in complete silence, like statues. Marcus backed away from the window, his pulse racing. He knew he needed to leave. He grabbed his bag and opened the door, stepping into the hallway as quietly as he could. The candle at the end of the hall flickered, casting long shadows along the walls. Just as he reached the top of the stairs, he heard the door to another room creak open behind him. He turned and saw a woman stepping out of a room, her face hidden beneath a thick veil, her hands clasped in front of her. She turned toward him, and he saw her eyes glint beneath the veil, wide and glassy. "You're not one of us," she whispered, her voice soft and eerie. "Not yet." Without a word, Marcus bolted down the stairs, his footsteps echoing through the silent inn. As he reached the bottom, he saw that the front door was shut, even though he was sure he'd left it open. He grabbed the handle and pulled, but it wouldn't budge. It felt like it was locked from the outside. He glanced back and saw more people filling the hallway, their faces expressionless, their eyes fixed on him. They moved slowly, deliberately, blocking his escape. Desperate, he ran to a side door and shoved it open, stumbling into the cold night air. He sprinted toward his car, the fog swirling thickly around him, but when he reached it, he froze. His car was gone. The clearing where he'd parked was empty, as if he'd never arrived in the first place. Panic flooded him as he looked around, his breaths coming in short gasps. The villagers were coming closer, moving toward him from all directions, their faces blank and emotionless, eyes shining in the lantern light. Marcus turned and ran down the road he'd come from, plunging into the fog, his footsteps loud on the dirt path. The forest felt endless, the trees looming tall and twisted above him. After what felt like hours, he spotted a break in the fog, a dim light ahead, and he ran toward it, hoping it was the main road. But as he reached the light, he realized with a sinking horror that he'd run in a circle. He was back at the village, standing in the same clearing, facing the same inn. The old man was waiting on the porch, his face still and blank, a faint smile on his lips. "You'll find your place here," he said softly, his eyes locking onto Marcus. "We all do eventually." Marcus backed away, but the villagers were closing in, forming a circle around him. Their faces were expressionless, their eyes empty, like something had hollowed them out, leaving only shells behind. The last thing he saw was their pale, glassy eyes staring down at him as they closed in, their hands reaching out, cold and unyielding. The next morning, a passerby driving along the main road saw a new sign he didn't remember seeing before. Crow Creek Village, next left. Curious, he turned down the road, hoping to find a quick stop to stretch his legs. But when he reached the village, he saw only a small, empty clearing. Lily had been driving through the desolate countryside all night. She was trying to get back to her hometown before dawn, but the road seemed to stretch on endlessly, with nothing but fields and the occasional line of trees on either side. She knew she had taken a wrong turn somewhere along the way, but with no GPS signal and no phone service, she was left to navigate on her own. As she continued, she spotted a sign up ahead. In faded, weathered letters, it read, "Old Harlow Road." She didn't remember seeing it on any map, but it was the first sign of civilization she'd seen in hours. She turned onto the road, thinking it might lead to a town or, at the very least, another highway. Old Harlow Road was narrow, with deep, dark woods pressing close on either side. The trees seemed ancient, their gnarled branches arching overhead like bony fingers. Her headlights barely cut through the darkness, and the further she drove, the quieter everything seemed. Even her radio, which had been playing static, suddenly went silent. Minutes passed, and Lily noticed that her gas was running low. She felt a stab of fear as she realized that if she didn't find a town soon, she'd be stranded in the middle of nowhere. She started scanning the roadside for any sign of a gas station or even a house. Then, just as her fuel gauge dipped into the red, she spotted something in the distance, a dim light shining through the trees. Relieved, she followed it, hoping it would lead to help. As she got closer, she saw a rundown building by the side of the road, an old gas station that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. A single faint light flickered above the pump, casting eerie shadows across the cracked pavement. Lily pulled up to the pump and got out of her car, feeling the stillness of the night settle around her. There was no sound, no movement, just the quiet hum of the single flickering light. She glanced at the door of the station, which was partially open, the inside completely dark. "Hello?" she called out, but there was no answer. She stepped closer, peering inside, when a rustling sound caught her attention. She spun around but saw nothing, just the trees looming tall and silent around her. Shaken, she decided to pump gas and leave as quickly as possible. She picked up the nozzle, but as she tried to start the pump, she realized it was broken, the handle rusted and unyielding. Frustrated, she looked around and noticed a small, handwritten sign taped to the pump. "Please pay inside." Reluctantly, she walked toward the open door of the station. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust and mildew. The counter was covered in old, yellowed receipts, and an ancient cash register sat silently, as though it hadn't been touched in years. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, but it was turned off. She called out again, but there was no response. As she turned to leave, she heard a faint shuffling sound behind the counter. She froze, her heart pounding, and slowly turned back. In the shadows, she could just make out a figure standing there, its outline barely visible. It was a man, tall and thin, his clothes tattered and his face obscured by the darkness. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice low and hollow, like it hadn't been used in years. Yes," Lily stammered, unnerved by his presence. "I need gas. I tried the pump, but it's not working." The man stared at her for a long moment, his eyes dark and sunken. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, he reached below the counter and pulled out an old gas can. He walked around the counter, his gaze never leaving her, and handed it to her with a hand that looked strangely gaunt, the skin stretched tight over his bones. "You can use this," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Lily took the can, her fingers brushing against his cold, dry skin. She mumbled a quick thank you and hurried back to her car, pouring the gas into her tank as quickly as she could. The man stood in the doorway watching her, his face still hidden in shadow. Once she was finished, she climbed into her car and started the engine, eager to get back on the road. As she pulled away, she glanced in her rearview mirror, expecting to see the man still standing there. But he was gone. The station was completely dark, as if no one had been there in years. Shaken, she focused on the road ahead, relieved to be driving again. But as she continued down Old Harlow Road, she noticed something strange. The trees seemed thicker, darker, and the road itself seemed to narrow, pressing her closer to the edge of the woods. Her headlights barely illuminated the way, and the road stretched on without any sign of an end. An hour passed, then 2, and still there was no turnoff, no sign, nothing but the dark, endless road. Her heart pounded as she realized she hadn't passed a single landmark or intersection. She checked her fuel gauge, and her stomach dropped. The tank was nearly empty again, despite having just filled it. Panicked, she slowed down, peering out her window, hoping to see something, anything, that would tell her she wasn't just going in circles. But there was nothing. Just darkness, the trees, and the silent, unchanging road. Then, up ahead, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The old gas station appeared out of the darkness, exactly as it had before, the single light above the pump flickering faintly. She pulled up to it, too stunned to do anything else, her mind racing. As she sat there, frozen, she noticed movement in the window of the station. The figure of the man appeared again, standing in the doorway, his dark, sunken eyes fixed on her. Desperate, Lily got out of the car and shouted, "How do I get out of here? I've been driving for hours, and I keep coming back to this place." The man said nothing, just watched her with those empty eyes. After a long silence, he raised a bony hand and pointed down the road. "Keep driving," he said, his voice barely audible. Frustrated and frightened, she climbed back into her car and drove off, hoping that this time she'd finally break free. She sped down the road, the dark forest blurring past her, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. But an hour later, the gas station appeared again, exactly as it had before, the man standing in the doorway watching her with that same hollow stare. Terrified, Lily screamed and slammed her fists against the steering wheel. She drove down the road again, and again, and again, each time hoping it would lead her somewhere new. But every time she found herself back at the gas station, trapped in an endless loop. As dawn broke, she was still driving, her eyes hollow, her face pale, her mind numb. The gas station appeared once more, the man waiting in the doorway. She pulled up to the pump, her movements slow and mechanical. She no longer had the energy to scream or cry. The man stepped forward, his hand outstretched, offering the same gas can as before. But this time, as she looked into his eyes, she saw something she hadn't noticed before. An emptiness, a void, as if he'd been driving on this same road once too, trapped in the endless loop, until he'd finally given up. With a sinking feeling, Lily took the gas can, filled her tank, and climbed back into her car. She drove down Old Harlow Road once more, knowing that no matter how many times she tried, she'd always come back to the same place. And as the fog swallowed her car, she realized that she was no longer trying to escape.